inherited monarchy, there are those who are fit to, I mean, these are ideas, you know, that we've buried. You know, those who are fit to rule and dynasties. So I have to stop making jokes about Bushes and Clintons and so on. But that there should be a move away from that and some kind of popular democratic structures in society and so forth. Those are the three currents of ideas that affect and influence Marx. In his early years, his writing is principally philosophical in nature. That's not true about Engels, who is less philosophical and goes more towards a kind of empirical analysis of the condition of the lower and oppressed classes in a rising industrial society. And that's the other thing to mention, is that you're talking about ideas that are being put forward as societies across Europe are being transformed as a result of an industrial revolution. Now, Marx becomes a left-winger in German philosophical circles. His first article, I think his first political article, is one against censorship and for the freedom of the press. And that's an idea that runs throughout Marx. You know, that is the defense of basic democratic freedoms of the press, of assembly, and so forth. Those were cornerstones in Marx's writing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's important to understand that he was not the first socialist. He was not the first person. You know, you mention the word class, and people say, "Oh my God, Marxism." Well, it's a little more complicated than that. You really have to have blinders not to know that there were classes in. That's a kind of propaganda illness here in this country. That it's all over the place that there's classes, but we're supposed to, you know, we're all middle class and we're all in the same boat and so on and so forth. That illness or that myopia did not exist in Europe. Everyone acknowledged that there were classes. In fact, the people at the top said there were classes. They just deserved to be at the top of the heap. That's all. You know, that was they belong there. Nor was it that Marx was the first person to say you can have an egalitarian or more cooperative means of living together, and, you know, without war, without racial oppression or racial discrimination, and so forth. I mean, he grows out of that tradition, but he's not the originator of that tradition. There's a lovely interview in the New York Tribune, I think it was called, yeah, it was the New York Tribune, that says, "Who's your hero?" And he answers, "Spartacus." And so he's with those who are fighting for justice, but he's not the originator, the first one to say classes, oppression, war exists. You can go back as far as the Peasant Revolt of 1381. It's only that I lived in England that I know about this. I don't mean for you to, you know, the equivalents apply elsewhere, in which the common saying in the Peasants' Revolt was, when Eve span, the common saying amongst peasants who were revolting. They weren't revolting, they were in revolt, I think is a more proper way to say that. When Eve span and Adam delved, who was then a gentleman? That is to say, the idea of a more egalitarian society of equality in which classes did not exist and competition was not the main driving force in that society. So while he was not the first to identify classes, he was the first in suggesting that the problem with previous philosophies and political attempts to create societies of equality or of mutual cooperation, that those attempts were by and large doomed to, not by and large, were doomed to failure due to the economic structures of society up until that time. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that, well, I'll sum it up in a phrase that he used. If need ever be generalized again, that is, if want ever be generalized again, all the old crap must revive. Now, that's a quotation from him. What did he mean by that? He meant that the contours of what was possible was determined by the way in which society was structured and what the core means by which wealth or production was produced in that given society. And if you had a society in which scarcity existed, you could not have a society of equality. That is because people would fight over scarce resources. Therefore, when you read Marx, you find that his attitude to capitalism is quite different to what you would expect it to be. I mean, for those, how many people have read the Communist Manifesto? Wow, great, that makes it my life. Well, I hope that makes my rendition of this easier to grasp. If you read it, he says capitalism is the single most revolutionary system to date. It's an enormous advance in production, in ideas. It breaks the fetters of the past. It breaks the constraints of the past. And he says this system is revolutionary, and he's very positive about it, precisely because it raises the level of the productivity of labor of humankind to such a degree that you can begin to think of a society of cooperation and equality. That is, where want is not generalized. And he says that that's true about capitalism because unlike previous social systems, say feudalism, or in ancient Rome, slavery, he says about feudalism, it's a lovely phrase, well, if you like that kind of thing. I thought it was a very good way of expressing it. The limits of exploitation in a feudal system are the walls of the stomach of the feudal lord. Now, what he meant by that is that the rich and powerful would squeeze their serfs, but it was for their own consumption, and to be fair, you'd have to say, to defend themselves or to attack other like feudal barons. Capitalism has a dynamic which, in spite of the wishes of those who run the system, is forced to constantly expand production, revolutionize the way in which things are produced, and therefore has a dynamic in which society changes very quickly, and the ability to produce plenty is therefore inbuilt in the system. Because if you don't, you die. Or, we'll come back to the present thing, what is too big to fail. But the dynamic is inbuilt, not because people, or the people who run the factories and means of production of wealth want to, they are forced to by the conditions of the system itself. Secondly, in regards to capitalism and its difference, it is an international system and therefore breaks down and makes possible the expansion of that system internationally, but also a broader cooperation between different peoples. And number three, he says, for the first time under capitalism, by the way, my numbering system is always very funny, because I say 1, 2, and 3, but so if you're a careful note taker, make sure to just reorder my numbering system, because I'm told that it goes 1, 2, 3, then 1, and then 4. Okay. Third point on this part of the why capitalism was exceptional is that it creates an oppressed class that, unlike previous oppressed classes, is collective in its character and therefore capable of democratic self-rule. Now, let me just explain. In other words, instead of individualized peasant properties, because of the Industrial Revolution and industry, you have the creation of big cities. Because of the creation of big cities and big areas of work, you have collaboration and cooperation built into the framework of competition between different firms and so forth. That is, if you want to put it as plainly as possible, it is impossible to imagine anything that we wear, drive, or eat without seeing that it is the result of human cooperation. But what is also just as astounding, it's human cooperation in a completely unplanned way. As a result, that is mediated through competition, not through some kind of planning to produce for human need. And what Marx says is, imagine what it would be like if instead of unplanned production for a market, which leads to, and I'm going to come back to this, which leads to economic crises of major proportions, you actually planned that kind of, what would be produced as opposed to leaving it simply to the market. Marx's conclusion from his analysis of capitalism and how he differed from previous socialist currents and people who wanted to transform and make society socialistic, cooperative, and so forth, is that he refuted the idea that the main problem was the education of the mass of the population, but rather, sorry, that's not the right way to put it. He defined his terms as materialist rather than idealist, meaning that the main problem in society wasn't that the people who ran it had bad ideas or were greedy or were just insufferable scumbags or whatever term you choose to use for your favorite, person that you don't like. They may well be that. I can think of a number of politicians who would fit nicely into the kind of, the title of insufferable scumbag. But it isn't just their personality, it's a structure, it's because of the structure of the system that they act in the way that they do. And secondly, he said that the movement that he was proposing was not an elitist movement, because previous socialist projects had been based on the idea that there are a few people who know the truth, and that the way to resolve it is to impart that truth to the majority of the population. And Marx says this is purely an elitist concept, because who will educate the educators? The idea that there are a few who know the truth, well, how did